Well, thank you. I wanted to welcome you to this very special event, both those in the room and those joining us virtually and watching from other spaces around the world. But particularly, I want to welcome the people who are in learner and comfortable seats, so you're very much with us. I'm Laila Abu-Lughod, and I teach anthropology and gender studies here at Columbia and direct the Middle East Institute. Among the many wonderful intellectual communities that I have the privilege of belonging to here, I want to mention the most relevant one for today. I'm a member of the faculty of the Center for Palestine Studies, the only such center based in an American university, dedicated to the academic... Thank you. It's dedicated to the academic study of Palestine. And the center's mission is to foster sustained interchanges among scholars and students and to advance the production and circulation of knowledge about Palestinian history, culture, society, and politics. Now, I don't want to take too much time away from our remarkable speakers today, but I do want to first thank those who've helped make this event possible. And I want to single out Mariam Zuhni and Dalia El-Zain. Thank you. Okay. We have an enthusiastic crowd. It's great. At the Center for Palestine Studies, and Mariam is hopefully watching us in Lebanon. I also want to thank my colleagues, Brinkley Messick and Rashid Khalidi, especially for their special dedication to this event. But we're also grateful to all the staff and volunteers that you've seen around here who've generously offered their time and talents. And it's a tribute to our speakers that so many units enthusiastically joined us as co-sponsors. The Institute for Research in African American Studies, the Institute for Research on Women and Gender, the Middle East Institute, the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race, the Hyman Center for the Humanities, the Anthropology Department, the Center for International History, and the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. Thank you all. Now, we've all done our parts because we want to honor Edward Said's memory and his legacy. And I want to acknowledge especially his daughter, Najla Said, who's here tonight representing the whole family. This is not the first event in his honor, nor will it be the last, but we think it's quite special, and I'm glad that you all thought so too. Edward Said taught at Columbia for 40 years, and we feel individually and as a community that we're part of his legacy at this university and in the world. Cornell West is now teaching across the street at Union Theological Seminary, and Judith Butler is teaching here in the Department of English and Comparative Literature. And this is a university that showed great integrity when Edward was alive in upholding the principles of both academic freedom and free speech. The university protected the right of this extraordinary figure to be both a deep and original scholar and a public intellectual. And I want to share just one personal memory. At Edward's funeral at Riverside Church 10 years ago, I felt sad as the large crowd, hushed and deeply moved by Daniel Barenboim's exquisite piano offering, walked down the aisle to leave the church. And I found myself walking near my dear colleague, Mahmoud Mamdani. I told him that I felt this marked the passing of a generation. Who would now speak for us? Iqbal Ahmed had passed away in 1999 at the Asia Society here in New York. Edward and my father, along with Dan Berrigan and many others, had mourned and celebrated this most charismatic, politically sharp, and beloved figure. 2 years later, my father passed away in Palestine. Edward walked alongside us in Jaffa with some other people in this room in May 2001 behind the coffin of his dear friend. And now, 2 years later, Edward Said. And I'll never forget what Mahmoud said. It's now up to you. But who among our generation could measure up? I thought then. And I think tonight on this platform, two of the most remarkable people of this generation have stepped forward, carrying the mantle, but speaking in their own distinct voices and from their own standpoints. Their critiques of injustice are clear and principled, their moral vision is exemplary, and their intellectual brilliance is unquestioned. Like Edward Said, they are teachers and scholars of huge distinction. And like him, they're at the same time public figures who speak out courageously about the major political and social issues of our time. Now, in talking about his work on the question of Palestine, Edward explained, as a quote, "I've been unable to live an uncommitted or suspended life. I've not hesitated to declare my affiliation with an extremely unpopular cause," unquote. Now, what I admire so much about Judith Butler and Cornel West is they're the same. They do not live uncommitted lives. They're intellectuals and philosophers who've shaped how we think about power, gender, race, injustice, and the value of human life. And they've not been afraid to think and talk about the situation of Palestinians, the consequences of Zionism, the violent policies of the Israeli state, and the links between forms of domestic and international injustice. They have affiliated with an unpopular cause. They didn't have to. But in doing what we New Yorkers are urged to do all the time now, if you see something, say something, I think they've given many more people that ability to see and to speak. And I'm talking about the next generation. So for me, these are two moral and intellectual giants of our generation, and I know they're not the same height. But I've admired them since I first met them, both coincidentally in Princeton around 25 years ago. And I'm so grateful on behalf of the Center for Palestine Studies and everyone else for their generosity in accepting our invitation to come talk with us and to each other. I know you're here because you want to know, because you know who they are and you want to hear them. So I won't go into their accomplishments. You have a little flyer with bios. But to help get the conversation started, I will turn things over now to James Sheamus. Familiar to some as a brilliant film theorist and professor at Columbia, some as a producer who's been keeping serious cinema alive, and to others as a screenwriter and longtime collaborator, in the good sense, of Ang Lee, who's joined us tonight too. He's also on the faculty of the Center for Palestine Studies. So please join me in welcoming Judith Butler, Cornel West, and James Sheamus to talk about Palestine and the public intellectual in honor of Edward Said.
Good evening, and thanks, Lila. Let me briefly lay out the format for tonight's event, meditate a bit on some of the questions its title might suggest to our speakers, and commence with the first question. Let's begin by acknowledging that this was a very hot ticket, and more on that in a second, and that tonight we are in, to borrow a phrase both from Israeli jurisprudence and from Judith Butler's recent work, a lot of absent presences. So while we will solicit questions to supplement and continue tonight's conversation, we're going to do so virtually in the hope that those of you not sitting with us in Low Library will feel the connection we here certainly feel with you. So if you'd like to join the conversation, tweet your question to @CU, lowercase Palestine, that's CU Palestine, using hashtag Edward Said, all lowercase, come on, it's hip, or post to our Facebook event page, Judith Butler and Cornel West in Conversation, by the Center for Palestine Studies at Columbia University. Operators are standing by, and in about 45 minutes to an hour or so, one of them will discreetly hand me a stack of questions and comments, and if and when the opportunity arises and the conversation finds a lull, I will share them with you. If, however, the conversation feels like it can continue uninterrupted, I'll hold fire and ask all of your forgiveness in advance if we entertain few, if any, questions. So some preliminaries to an initial question prompted by the subtitle of tonight's event, Palestine and the Public Intellectual Honoring Edward Said. I'll briefly break down some of those constituent parts and in preface to the conversation it announces. First, honoring Edward Said. This evening takes place as one of a wonderful number of events commemorating Edward Said, and as such it prompts, if not begs, the question as to the uses and reasons for those commemorations, honorifications, memorializations, and celebrations. A couple of weeks ago in Lerner Hall, Edward Said was remembered. Last week, his memorial lecture was delivered. Tonight, he is honored. It is appropriate under such circumstances to ask whether and how his memory is working and how it should be working. Now, how's it working for us, for you? One use, of course, arises for the simple conjunction of the name Edward Said with the word Palestine. And here I feel the need to try to articulate a specific and particular sense of excitement about tonight's conversation. Let's face facts. Each of tonight's interlocutors alone is, to use the language of celebrity, which raises its own questions but also feels somewhat appropriate tonight, a hot ticket. But together, in conversation, present to each other, this does feel like a moment, an event. And the territory, occupied or otherwise, where they come together tonight is, well, Palestine. Tonight, it feels as though, unlike perhaps in Edward Said's day, it is not the question of Palestine. Rather, it is Palestine that is asking the questions. Indeed, Palestine is demanding answers. The feeling of that feels, if I can put it that way, significant and exciting. Then we have this word public. What is a public, or to ask the question another way, what do publics do, and what might they be doing here tonight? Well, unlike, let's say, proletariats or peoples or communities or masses or plebes, publics seem mainly to have opinions. Or we could say have opinions ascribed to them. But for Edward Said, though, the word public always held out the promise of its Enlightenment origins as the site of public reason, as a place where genuine truths can emerge. That's why for Said, there is no need for the category of public intellectual, for the intellectual is, by his definition, always public, someone who publishes, who comes into being as such by making representations to a public. As he writes in his wonderful volume, Representations of the Intellectual, there's no such thing as a private intellectual. The intellectual, he says, quote, is an individual endowed with a faculty for representing, embodying, articulating a message, a view, an attitude, philosophy, or opinion to, as well as for, a public. To, as well as for. The intellectual represents, paradoxically teaching her public something, in a sense, it already knows, but just doesn't know that it knows. Teaching it, in the Saidian version, the unknown truth about what it really is. It's a strange role that requires the intellectual to come into being wholly in relation to the public, but to not be the public or even part of the public, to be a representation. For Said, the intellectual stands outside, and mainly, again, with a nod to his Enlightenment heritage, because, as Said writes, the intellectual speech is always on behalf of universal principles. The weight of that universal burden makes the intellectual anything other than the usual expert sent out to manage the public through his or her expertise. Said's intellectual paradoxically maintains the social prestige and authority of the intellectual class, but is, as he puts it, someone who cannot easily be co-opted by governments or corporations, and whose raison d'etre is to represent all those people and issues that are routinely forgotten or swept under the rug. And here you see another paradoxical dialectical leap in Said's thinking. The public that the intellectual is to represent to the public is actually the abjected, the forgotten, the oppressed. That is to say, outsiders, whose outsiderness is mimicked by the intellectual, but now from a position of authority, if not of power. Heavy burdens to bear, which is no doubt why Said constantly references the intellectual's, well, crankiness. Least of all, he writes, quote, should an intellectual be there to make his or her audiences feel good? The whole point is to be embarrassing, contrary, even unpleasant. It's as if for Said, the repulsion felt by the proper public for those habitually abjected and excluded must, if only as a moment of negative pleasure, be felt also in the presence of the intellectual. I think I speak on behalf of tonight's public when I say how excited I am to be here to listen in on what I know will be, in honor of Edward Said, a truly embarrassing, contrary, and unpleasant conversation. And let's start it by asking, as we've asked about what memorializations do, what publics do, what intellectuals do, and what Palestine does, a simple question you need entertain only by ignoring it. What actually are we doing here tonight? Thanks.
How are we doing?
I'm just blessed to be here with you, my
Yeah,
dear
that's what I
sister,
feel.
and to keep the focus on the rich legacy and
Yeah.
the witness that Edward Said was able to bear, trying to tell the truth in the best of his fallible yet creative ability, and yet at the same time to inspires so many of us.
It's true.
Inspires so many of us, though. No, what do you think we're doing here?
Hard to hear?
Oh, is that right? Oh, you missed all of that? No, I said we're here to bear witness and to tell the truth, the memory of my dear brother Edward Said.
Yeah. It's interesting. I was thinking about the fact that we are memorializing and we're honoring. And yet, it seems to me that for the most part, when we talk about Edward Said's work, we speak in the present tense. And we have to, because it's a work that was written more than a decade ago, ceased to be written a decade ago. At the same time, it acts on us, and we read it, and it has informed. It's not only in our present time, but it's given us, I think, a new sense of what present time might be, how we tell the story of this time, how we understand ourselves in time. And so to honor him is in part to memorialize him, but perhaps there's a counter-memorializing that happens not by dishonoring him, but by allowing the work to live in the present as we take it up and rethink it for our own time, or for our various times. One thought I have is that there was a point in his work where he insisted that when we look at literature, and especially when we look at representations of Palestine or representations of dispossession or exile, forcible exile, that we have to pay attention to the form. And he said it must be fragmentary, it must be partial. There's no single narrative we can tell, there's no single motif we can tell, and that it must interrupt certain dominant narratives. It must have the power to interrupt certain dominant narratives. And that's interesting because it opens up the question of, if we think about the founding of Israel in 1948, or the incremental forms of settler colonialism that were already in place prior to 1948, that were in some sense the precondition of that founding. How do we tell that story? And how can that story be taught? How is it taught? And of course, one crucial point he made is that the story of that founding rests upon the forcible dispossession and exile of nearly 900,000 people. The number of Palestinian exiles in his time was, he gathered about 4 million, and now it's estimated to be 5. And that includes, of course, subsequent expulsions and dispossessions. But how is it that we tell the story of that founding and also tell the story of the Nakba? Can they be told at the same time? Can they be told together? Are we yet ready to think about the link between that founding and not only the radical dispossession of that time, but a continuing dispossession and a continuing injustice that has not been acknowledged internationally, that has not been addressed adequately, that continues as a traumatic feature of our present? Two questions of time. How do we tell the one story with the other? How do we link them? How do we grasp that link? How do we understand that that's not just something that happened in history, but that it pervades the historical time in which we live?
See, I think that if we begin with the notion of the catastrophic, remember when Edward, at the very end of his life, he said, "I'm the last Jewish intellect." And what he meant by that was that for him, because he's part of a highbrow secular humanist tradition, and which means the legacies of Athens and Jerusalem, for him, one must begin with the catastrophic. It could be the Nakba of Palestinians. It could be slavery in the New World with people of color. It could be homophobic forms. It could be the Holocaust and Shoah. And it's very rare in the academy that the catastrophic is really dealt with in any rigorous way. So Edward comes along and says, well, I am a secular humanist. Like Hayden White, like Eric Auerbach, I am a student of Vico. And Vico was about what? Robust voluntarism, militant will in the face of what? Chaos, which is very interesting. You know, in Edward's dissertation, he wrote at Harvard under Harry Levin, he actually, the major influence is Schopenhauer. People forget about that in Edward's early work. He and I used to talk about that all the time. I was blessed in 1977 when I first arrived here. I went straight to Edward's lectures, and he was lecturing on Lukács, Goleman, Raymond Williams, Mere Old Marxism, literature, and so forth. And we would steal away and have drinks and things, and talk about Schopenhauer, because I'm very much Schopenhauer. And, you know, Arthur Danto taught a course on Schopenhauer. We just lost Brother Arthur Danto.
Yes, we did.
Never forget his name in so many ways. But it was very important because Schopenhauer was dealing with human existence as catastrophic. You see? Now, what happens when you historicize and contextualize the catastrophic? Structures of domination, forms of oppression, and, following Vico, agency, will. Not just what you're going to do about it, how do you understand about it? How do you understand it? So Edward was a rational humanist. He'd always talk about the 1936 essay by Boycott, which was about sur-rationalism. He said, I'm a sur-rationalist. What is a sur-rationalist? It's a rationalist who grounds it in passion, and your quest for rationality takes the form of turbulence, of transgression, of subversion. So he's a rational humanist in that sense, and therefore when it came to Palestine, this is another beginning of catastrophe with dispossession, with dislocation, with expatriation, and then occupation, then colonialization, and then resistance, even as all of those are rendered invisible in mainstream academic discourse. Not all the mainstream. We got Brother Rashid right here in his wonderful work. And that recent text, Brokers of Deceit, everybody got to read that now, because that's telling the same kind of truth Edwards was talking about. How do you talk about the catastrophic and talk about the colonization, talk about the dispossession, talk about the occupation in such a way that you remain a humanist, which is to say, you would talk critically about that, be it of any occupation. See, if there were a Palestinian occupation of Jews, Brother Edward Said would be the first one in line critical of the Palestinian occupation. That's the kind of brother he was. My kind of brother. He has a moral consistency about it. He has a concern or refuses the two distinctive features of this declining American empire, which is callousness to catastrophe, especially when it comes to poor and working people, and indifference to criminality. Indifference to crimes against humanity. He understood the Palestinian predicament starting in 1948 as a crime against humanity. He's absolutely right about that. And we don't want to come to terms with it, and to the degree to which we don't come to terms with it, it will haunt us in a serious way. But of course, he would never focus solely on that catastrophe, because he talked about different crimes against humanity. A variety of different crimes. It could be the new Jim Crow right now in the American empire. That's a crime against humanity. We've lost 2 generations of young black and brown youth almost across the board. That's a crime against humanity. It will come back and haunt America in a variety of different ways. But Edward said, no, I'm in the academy, Princeton undergrad, Harvard grad, R.P. Blackmore, Arthur Zasmary at Princeton. Students go read his senior thesis on Joseph Conrad and Graham Greene. Then read the dissertation on Joseph Conrad in the fiction of autobiography, his first book that he wrote under Harry Levine, one of the founders of Complit, a Jewish brother from Nebraska. Then he comes to Columbia, and here's Lionel Trilly and the others waiting to greet him and treating him very nicely, embracing, empowering in that way. And then he turns this intellectual powerhouse that he was and his skills to the catastrophe beginning in 48, and we begin to tell that story. So the question of who is Edward Said? America's leading public intellectual in the latter part of the 20th century. Who is Edward Said? Highbrow secular humanist. Who is Edward Said? Courageous visionary. What were the limitations of Edward Said? Oh, we got a lot to talk about there too. American popular culture, not too sympathetic. He's wrong. Religion, not as religiously musical as he could have been. He's wrong. So, I mean, and that would be the first one, because we talked about this all the time. He loves that kind of critical engagement. But he had his own blind spots, and he understood, following Paul DeMond, that you can't have broad scope of insight without having blindness inscribed within the framework that allows you to see that there's an interplay between blindness and insight. That's true for all of us. You can imagine what they'll say about the most philosophically sophisticated social theorists of our day, Judith Butler, what they'll talk about, the insights and whatever blindnesses Sister Judith had too.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not here to talk about that, but
No.
I'm just saying,
No, I'm sure I'm about to enact them, so
No.
that'll be okay. But so let's talk for a moment about secular humanist. You know, I didn't know Edward, and I thought back on why it is I did not know him.
You'd have a wonderful conversation.
Maybe so, maybe not. What's interesting to me, we did email briefly when we were both angry at Lawrence Summers for his ridiculous claim that to criticize Israel is effectively to be anti-Semitic. And so we had a little virtual solidarity at that moment, but it was not very far before he died. But I was thinking that at the time, say in the 90s especially, you know, there were people who were humanists, and then there were post-structuralists, or
Right.
there were people who were secularists, and then there are the rest of us who didn't really know, or maybe had some questions about that term. And so we didn't come into conversation for kind of petty literary critical reasons, right? Which now seem rather petty to me because
Exactly.
I just am not having those conversations in that way. So I went back and I thought to myself, what work does secular do for Said, and what work does humanist do? Why those terms? Why did he feel he needed them? What work did they do that no other term could do? Or and I found the following, which was very interesting to me. First of all, when he talks about the secular, he tends to oppose it to what he calls fundamentalisms, or to religion understood as the demand for theocratic rule. Theocratic rule. Okay. Well, okay. I understand that. He opposed secular nationalists, interestingly. So secular must have a critical relationship to nationalism, right? I'm starting to understand a little bit about what it does. But what it seems to do more often than not is to name possibilities of connection or translation among exiled peoples, right? He wanted to hold out for that. And he made the claim, I think it was indirectly a claim about Jews in relation to Israel, but it has a more general applicability, that when we, any of us, represent our oppression, our dispossession, our forcible exile, the slaughters committed against us, that we have to not only make that representation clear, but also turn it around and ask for whom else is that happening? Has that happened? And also, have I or have we, this people who have suffered, also caused a suffering for others? And what responsibility do we take for it? And you have to ask those two questions. Who am I linked with in my oppression? And have I myself become an oppressor inadvertently or deliberately, thinking that my historical victim status makes it definitionally impossible for me to oppress others? Okay, so those were kind of two obligations that he understood as obligations of the secular, interestingly enough, which suggested that there was a certain dislocation of the first-person perspective that has to happen within what he calls the secular. Now, I think there are all kinds of ways to bring religion into that picture. We could all agree on that. We could all agree that those are values. The translation among exiled peoples, the self-reflective moment, what have I myself done? Not only what have I suffered, what have we suffered, but what have we done? How do I put those together? How do I keep those two histories from being delinked systematically, right, which is part of the history of pre- and post-Zionism. And you know, there's a moment, I believe it's in Representations of the Intellectual, where he refers to Hanan Ashrawi's dissertation, which I didn't know about. And there she claims that the Palestinian people are those whose national experience belongs with that of, meaning alongside or juxtaposed with, belongs alongside that of the Armenians, the Jews, the Irish, the Cypriots, the American blacks, the Poles, the American Indians, at those terrifying frontiers where the existence and disappearance of peoples fade into each other, where resistance is a necessity, but where there is also sometimes a growing realization of the need for an unusual and to some degree an unprecedented knowledge. And this was for Said a moment to which he returned time and again. So when he says, I'm the last of the Jewish intellectuals, it's like, yes, but maybe he's the last of the Armenian intellectuals, or maybe he's the last of the black intellectuals. In other words, it's not just Palestinian and Jew, it's a way of thinking the Palestinian historical experience in some kind of conjunction. Not to say that they're structurally the same or to posit an equivalence, but to say that there's some kind of affiliation, solidarity, demand for translation that emerges in and through that kind of juxtaposition. Now, I will sign on that. I will say, yes, I will sign on that. I don't know if that makes me a secularist to say that, but for him, it does.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he put much weight on the secular in that regard. But what's fascinating is that, see, on the one hand, one could argue that there was a certain religious tone deafness in a narrow sense in Brother Edward. On the other hand, he wrote some of the most beautiful, insightful reflections on Kierkegaard and on Gerard Manley Hopkins in Beginnings. And those are Christian thinkers. Those are Christian thinkers. At the same time, you think, for example, who some of his heroes were when it comes to intellectual models. Jonathan Swift, Tory. Well, what is it about Jonathan Swift? You remember his definition of intention in Beginnings is the link between idiosyncratic view and communal concern. That's the definition of it in that 1975 text. And what is it about Jonathan Swift? He's wrestling with the catastrophic, especially the Irish question, as with Edmund Burke and others. He's unbelievably, magnificently, this is where Harold Bloom and Edward Said come together. Because for Jonathan Swift, both of them are the towering satirical writers in the English language, Tell of Two Tubs and so forth. Who's the other hero of Edward Said? Glenn Gould. That's in the late style essay, right? With the introduction by Sister Miriam herself, which is wonderful, and Michael Wood. Now, what does it mean for a secular humanist intellectual to view a classical pianist as the model of what it is to be an intellectual? Well, what does he say in that essay? He says Glenn Gould was able to bring together a idiosyncratic and profound subjectivity. Same theme. And this book was written published after he died. This was a text he was writing on when he died. And of course, the text on, humanism and secular humanism. And, you know the text, what's the name of that?
I'm not quite sure.
Secular criticism as democratic something.
Humanism and democratic criticism.
Humanism and democratic criticism. That's the last book he finished. But he was working on late style. And when you get to Glenn Gould, he said, well, Glenn Gould is able to bring together a form of rational pleasure, or bringing together the rational and the pleasurable in a radically transgressive way that links idiosyncratic view with communal concern. So he has a consistency in his corpus now. So now what would be exilic about Glenn Gould? Everything. But he's not Palestinian, he's not black, and so forth and so on. What is exilic about Jonathan Swift? Nearly everything. But he's a right-wing Tory too. And Edward's very critical of that. But there's other elements in his literary practice, in his Weltanschauung, in his worldview that Edward embraces wholeheartedly. And of course, the other hero was Adorno. Yeah. And Adorno was half Jewish in terms of, lineage, but in terms of his practice, if Jew or Armenian or black or gay or lesbian or working class or whatever is a metaphor for those who have critical distance from a mainstream and a streamlined, deodorized set of discourses that don't want to come to terms with the catastrophic, the underside of that mainstream, then you are Jewish intellectual, Armenian intellectual, whatever you want to call it. For Edward, it was Jewish intellectual because he's looking at the history of Western civilization. I mean, look at the history of Western civilization, the persistence of that catastrophe hunting Jews down. And then the irony of those Jewish brothers and sisters of conservative bent and centrist bent. We're not talking about Jewish radicals. We're not talking about Jewish communists. We're not talking about Jewish left-wingers. Jewish conservatives and centrists in 1948 who engage in a discourse that hides and conceals the suffering of precious Palestinians as they undergo dispossession, as they undergo expatiation, as they undergo occupation after 67, to this very day, at this very moment, a level of very, very vicious form of colonization. And for Edward, for him, it's a kind of seamless web with all of the dissonance and all of the contradictions shot through in terms of his own self-understanding in this regard. He talks about C.L.R. James, he talks about James Baldwin, he talks about Malcolm X in this text.
And he puts C.L.R. James and Adorno together.
Absolutely, yes he does. Yes he does.
But I guess I would just add that it's also the liberal Zionist Jewish community which keeps that
that's true.
that keeps that narrative in place. So it's not just conservative and right.
Well, for me, liberals are centrists these days.
Okay, liberals are centrists. But also, interestingly enough, some of the writings that supported the kibbutz movement also were solidly within settler colonialism.
No, that's true.
You know,
That's
Gabriel
true.
Peterberg, I think, lays that out in a pretty convincing way. So we have to wonder about what it is to think about Zionism, perhaps even in some of its left-wing modes, as being complicit with settler colonialism, even on the left, even what is called the left. And one of the discursive problems we've got, right, is what do we call the left? Who's left?
That's right. Who's left of the left?
What's left of the left?
That's right.
But also what gets to be called the left, which is still maybe part of a colonial project. And that's where I think he thought intellectuals should come to the fore. He called it marshaling a certain kind of realism, alertness. He was especially enraged by inconsistency and uncareful thinking, so that we don't simply take some of these political designations as givens. We have to ask what work they do, what effacements they perform.
Absolutely. But I think part of it, though, at least from my dialogues with Brother Edward, is that in the 1980s, I mean, we witnessed, of course, the increasing bureaucratization and corporatization of the university. Because Edward was in love with the university. He lectured right here. I'll never forget, I was sitting right on the front row. He lectured with the title, Home. That was the name of the lecture, Home. And he talked about Columbia University as home. And I told Edward, said, you got to be kidding, brother. But he says right in this text too, as you know, the university is the most utopian space in our society. Now, I don't agree with that. I think the Apollo on Wednesday night actually is. But Edward was invested in the university. Even as exilic as he was in his thinking, he loved the university context. And he saw the university undergoing commodification, bureaucratization, where critical engagement was pushed to the margins as big money more and more shaped the destiny and the agenda and the paradigms of the university. He's absolutely right about that 20 years later. And therefore liberalism more and more was not captive, but it was disproportionately shaped by a careerism in which hypocrisy and cowardliness, because a lot of the liberal Zionists, brothers and sisters, would call Edward and say, we agree what you're talking about. We just can't say that in public.
I know.
Why? Because they were scared. Because their careers were at stake. Because they didn't want to go against their friends. because it made their Thanksgiving dinners uncomfortable. If they told the truth. Tony Judith went through the same thing at a much lower level than Edward Said. Said, of course, had, the military folk here at his office. The security at his office. We remember that, Sister Naja, right? Anytime you go see the brother, you got to go through security check. Death threats and so forth. And we know about the 285 FBI file on his, keeping track of him every minute, going back to 1971 with Ibrahim, the great Ibrahim, one of the greatest Palestinian towering figures. His file even bigger. Sister Janet too, your beloved mother. So that the liberal Zionists didn't want to undergo that kind of risk either. It was just too much. Oh my God. If we're going to tell the truth, we have to really pay a cost. You don't say. You got to bear a burden. You don't say. I recall in 1982, Edward and I went down in front of the New York Times just to get the numbers of how many folk were killed in Lebanon. They wouldn't even print the numbers. Then we had to march again just to use the word occupation in the newspaper. Then they didn't want to call it a wall. They called it a divide. Deodorized discourse. They're afraid, they're intimidated. Edward Said followed Parasia, that line 24a in Plato's Apology. It's free, it's frank speech. It's that, what is Foucault's definition? Fearless speech.
Fearless speech. Yeah.
Unintimidated speech. That's the cause of my unpopularity. That's what Socrates said. Edward said, yes, that's part of my tradition too. I got some plain speech about this catastrophe of Palestinians linked to not just the U.S. empire, but linked to the cowardliness of autocratic Arab countries who were tied to big oil interests. It's not just the pro-Israeli lobby in the conservative sense, it's the big oil dictation that allows for the Arab complacency and subservience, even as they talk about their concern with the Palestinians. Brother Rashid lays this out, and probably he just lays it out clearly. It's the truth. I tried to lay it out in Democracy Matters in 2004. They call me an anti-Semite all the time. I said, you know what? Doesn't bother me. I'll tell the truth. You get marginalized? Tell the truth. Said, professor of terror, that's what Commentary Magazine said, right? He's a professor of terror for throwing one rock. But Israeli Defense Forces never called terroristic, ever, by the mainstream newspapers, right? You can kill 434 Palestinian children within weeks, what's happened in January 2009. Kill 1,400, right, when Obama was coming into office. What do you have to say, Mr. Obama? No comment.
Nothing.
What do you mean, no comment? Those children are just as precious as those precious Jewish children in Tel Aviv who are being killed. What are you talking about, no comment? Said's legacy makes all of us uncomfortable, deeply so, even as we come back exercising our agency. Because, again, as I said, we have our criticisms of Brother Edward. We wouldn't ever want to highlight him in such a way that he becomes somehow some grand deity at the head of a pantheon. That's not the Brother Edward I knew. No, not at all. He was wrong on jazz and a lot of other things. But in terms of what worked, the secular, what worked the human, our human word, of course, derives from the Latin humando, which means burying. And Edward begins where Vico begins, not with a conception of death, abstract death like Heidegger. He begins with corpses. Qualitatively different discourse. He begins with corpses as opposed to abstract possibilities of death. And so at the very beginning of even his text beginnings is a sense of loss. It's elegiac. He's always concerned about what is lost and what's left out. He's always concerned about forms of death, be it psychic, be it social, be it psychological, even spiritual. He wouldn't like that language, spiritual, but I'm injecting that. A spiritual death. And that is what a great humanist thinker does. Even, the critics of humanism in that way know they have to come to terms with death and loss and catastrophe and oppression and domination in some way. But let me ask you this, though. So what would be your critique, though, of Edward's secular humanism?
Well, it's just that when I finally understand what he wants the terms to do, yes. I tend to agree with him. I'm just
about
not
agency and
the agent, the Vico, I think, is really quite amazing. I think I would have a little bit of struggle with it. Do we just create ourselves?
Right.
Or do we just produce ourselves? I think not. I think we are produced very often by forces we don't really have a lot of control over. And I think there's a kind of tragic structure to subject formation that that needs to be thought. We're formed in history, we're formed in language and culture and power, we're formed in traditions. We don't get to choose our parents, we don't get to very often choose many things about the circumstances, and not just the circumstances of our birth, but the very sense of who we are and the sense of the world. And then you struggle within it. You struggle within it to find your place and to make of yourself what you can, but there's, you know, how do we think about that struggle, you know? He was in a different position. He was worried explicitly and always about the fading of the history of Palestine, the fading of Palestinian culture, the pushing of Palestine into oblivion, that it would become, it would be something that no one would remember, or that there would be no way to install the memory, to archive it, to insist on it. And so oblivion was what he was fighting against, right? And being able to remake that history was also a way of giving himself a ground, being able to make sure that history remained alive. And I think that's really, really important. But I think sometimes we're born into traditions that overwhelm us or encumber us or against which we have to struggle. And I think probably my own struggle with my own Zionist and Jewish formation has been one of those. I mean, the question of Palestine actually made me have to think very reflectively about what I was born into and what I was taught and how the world was told to me, what story of the world I was given. And I had to think twice about who are those people who told me that story and why were they doing that? And what story do I now want to tell, or how do I want to interrupt that one, which is right at the heart of the liberal Jewish political world. But so let me just say this, though. What I like and what I need, I mean, it's so funny that we were on different sides of a certain kind of intellectual spectrum, but now I don't think I can think without him. Sorry I didn't get to tell you.
Fascinating.
But what I get from him, especially reading about his own experiences of being attacked or being called anti-Semitic or people saying vile and hideous things against this elegant, brilliant, erudite, reasonable person, right? Deeply reasonable person, is that he says that the intellectual, who is, yes, always a public intellectual in the sense that when we publish, we're in the world and we put our stuff out there and we are exposed, who knows what's coming back or not coming back. It's a risk, he says. You have to reconcile the demands of your own self with the public demands upon you. And that was helpful to me. And he talks about alertness as a kind of virtue of the public intellectual, or the intellectual who is trying to respond to a certain kind of public demand or public situation. He uses the word vulnerability. He doesn't use the word courage so much, but he was courageous.
Oh, yes.
And
Absolutely.
whatever that struggle was, to continue to speak out and to say what he had to say, even though he was being viciously attacked and people were trying to demean him. Just as we know, Palestinian professors here at Columbia who try to do scholarship on Palestine have also been shamelessly attacked. How does one emerge from the attack? How does one fend it off? I mean, you said you didn't care that people called you anti-Semitic. Well, I don't know. I bet you cared a little.
As long as the bullets didn't fly.
As long as the bullets didn't fly. But don't you kind of feel like the bullets are just right behind that? I mean, are they that far behind?
I've been called worse, though. But
Have you?
I hear what I do hear what you're saying. It's not that I celebrated it or anything, but I knew, given the discursive terrain, by saying these kinds of things, it was predictable that you would get that kind of nonsense coming at you. But you just have to make sure that you in no way are degrading Jewish brothers and sisters as a whole when you're engaging in a critique of a vicious Israeli occupation. And you make that severance very clear in your work, in your speeches and so forth, and you just move on because you don't want it to paralyze you.
I mean, I just restate it. I said, there's nothing particularly anti-Semitic by also taking issue with Zionism as in addition to the occupation, which is really, I felt like the history to which he was really returning to, like telling that history again and again. In the 40s and in the 50s and what that meant for displacement and for the stealing of land. But what I loved about the fact that he got so viciously attacked, I mean, I hate the fact that he got viciously attacked and that these vicious attacks continue still. But what I appreciate is that he seemed to get calmer and more rational, right? He just went back. He said, okay, let's take the argument apart. Let's move carefully. Let's be more careful. Let's be more precise. Let's talk about it historically. Let's talk about it conceptually. Mm-hmm. Let's use some counterexamples. Mm-hmm. Let's write with absolute persuasive lucidity. I don't know. I think that I don't know how to fathom it, but it's a great thing, and it is perhaps a kind of virtue. I don't think we can mime it or follow it. I mean, it was his, but we have to kind of ask that question of ourselves. How do we take those risks and not become a purveyor of deodorized discourse, not become a kind of pure professional who cares only about professional standing or who won't risk one's reputation by speaking what one knows to be true and unjust. Right.
With the scholarly apparatus that Edward would bring to it. I mean, I think, for example, of the exchange between Brother Edward and Brother Michael Walzer in that famous essay that Edward wrote, Exodus, a Canaanite perspective, a Canaanite view, what the Exodus looked like from the vantage point of the folk who are in the land of milk and honey. They're already there, like indigenous peoples when the Europeans arrived here. And then they were wonderful exchange. And it was right down here in New York at the New Yorker Hotel, right near Madison Square Garden. I remember I saw Blue Magic that night before. And you got Walzer and Zaid going at it. And Zaid laying bare the critique of an Exodus narrative about liberation for particular peoples and the subjugation that followed therefrom. And then Walzer saying, well, no, Edward, you are enchanted by a romance with the isolated intellectual who valorizes transgression that ends up with the attention more on the isolated intellectual than on the collective insurgency of the people you're speaking on behalf of. Now, that was fascinating because in one sense it's about what is the role of tradition. See, Edward had a modernist sensibility, so he was very suspicious of tradition in a certain sense. But then when you turn to After the Last Sky, which is one of the great texts on Palestinian traditions of resistance, traditions of poetic expression, traditions of collective insurgency, you say, lo and behold, you're actually a little closer to Edmund Burke than you think. The Burke who talks about tradition as inescapable, not a traditionalist understanding of tradition, but a transgressive, subversive understanding of tradition that generates traditions of resistance. And Edward was honest about that, because when he started talking about the Palestinian question, he had to dig deeper. I remember right across the street when he sent me the copy of Orientalism before it was published. We talked for 2.5 hours. And I said, Brother Edward, you have written a text that will create a fissure in the public discourse. But my one criticism is I don't hear the voices of those who have been orientalized at the level that I want. You're so concerned about the structure of the dominant discourse, they don't talk back enough. They don't respond enough. And what is a tradition? People, even in catastrophic situations, in melancholic spiritual conditions, oftentimes they still fight back. They resist politically, spiritually, collectively, and so forth. They sing spirituals. They create hip-hop as a genre in a declining American empire of economic inequality, political paralysis, cultural decay. They still fight back. And he said, Think you got a point, Brother West. Think you got a point. And he would listen, and he'd respond right back. Subsequent text. Chomsky actually said the same thing to him because he showed me Chomsky's letter. But you can't do everything in one text. And he knew that, you see. But in saying that, back to your point about the kind of a certain kind of secular humanism tied to an individual intellectual. So that in the lectures there in London, representations of the intellectual, there it looks like he was going back to a certain kind of isolated intellect. He was talking very personally, very personally. And then he'd come right back in subsequent texts and talk about tradition as resistance again. So he's back and forth. Very complicated, sometimes contradictory. Never fully confused, but always creative and challenging.
Maybe it's also important to remember that there were those important editorials that he was writing in the Al-Ahram
Arabic
in weekly, and that those tended to be really very concrete about political initiatives, what was happening on the ground, what political parties were doing, who the brokers were, what the stakes were. And that seemed to be a different kind of writing, right? He was very, very, very obviously attuned to the concrete political terms of the struggle at that point. I think maybe that would have been the more effective rejoinder to Mr. Well, you call him Brother Walter, but I can't quite do that.
No, I understand. I understand.
I don't know, Uncle Michael. Anyway.
But in those pieces, you know, you get these devastating critiques of PLO leadership.
Yes.
Devastating critiques of why he's had to distance himself from dominant elements in the Palestinian.
But you know, there's something about exile. Maybe I'll just say this, and we can open it up. But something about exile. You know, at one point he says exile is a concrete condition. It's also a metaphor. Okay. In other words, it is this particular people dispossessed. But first of all, we have to ask the question: does exile? Does it talk about? Does it adequately or equally embrace Palestinians with damaged rights within the Israeli state currently? Does it describe well Palestinians living under occupation in the West Bank or Gaza, or in Gaza, which I consider to be a kind of, you know, under siege, maybe a continuation of occupation by other means? Does it, do those communities, or those and then those who are intellectuals in New York, is it the same as being in a refugee camp in the south of Lebanon? Or and I just think maybe I'm not sure exile can do all that work. I'm not sure it can do all that work well. And when it's both a condition and a metaphor, it's also not just the condition of Palestinians, let's remember, but the link between the Palestinians and the native peoples and the Jews and the Cypriots and the African Americans and all the others he's willing to list there, at which point it's doing a whole lot of work.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
And then the other question is, so where's belonging? Where's belonging? There's always a longing to belong. But what about communities in which belonging is being reproduced all the time? Right, and he does say that in After the Last Sky. I mean, especially some of those photographs of people in their domestic spaces continuing to lay the table and continuing to go through the rituals of everyday life that consolidate a certain kind of tradition and history instead of connections. But at the political level, what kind of forms of belonging are they? And if he's against certain kinds of nationalism, how do we think about belonging to the Palestinian nation across these various scattered zones? If it's not a nationalism, is there another language for it? Would have been interesting to push those questions about belonging and solidarity.
Crucial question. And then the micro-social institutions, family. Edward Said and family. The sister just written this wonderful reflection on our own life and so forth. Played a very important role. As I mentioned, universities, very important. I was blessed to give a lecture at Northfield, Mount Hermon, where he went to prep school. And they're still talking about him there. William Spanos and others who taught him there. because the brother was a genius. There's no doubt about it. Early on, you can see it. Blackmer told him that right there on Nassau Street in Princeton. That's 1950, what? Did he come out of Princeton, 57, 58, something like that? 2 years after Ralph Nader? Ralph Nader came out, I forget which one. But I mean, in the mid-50s. So that he did have certain desire for long, and that he didn't theorize. That was microsocial in a sense. It wasn't nationhood, but family, certainly friends. My God, his loyalty to me as a revolutionary, almost a communist Christian, as a revolutionary Christian, unbelievable. And anytime you mention Christianity, Edward, you got to turn away, even though he came out of a Christian context from his grandparents and so forth, you see. But he had his own critiques and so forth. But the loyalty was so real, it was genuine. We had human connections. We found out he had leukemia. I said, brother, I'm getting down on my knees in your living room. I brought Reverend James Forbes and Reverend James Washington. 3 of us, we prayed for him right there. In September 1991, I'll never forget as long as I live. All of us had tears in our eyes.
He let you pray for him?
But he was secular.
You got to hedge your bets.
He was secular. You can say, you can fight this one on your knees, but I'm glad you're down there. But I'm secular now, y'all. But he knew the love was being expressed. That's the important thing. And that's microsocial, too, as opposed to a nation state or a political party. And so, yeah.
So we got about 15 minutes, and I hold in my hand some questions. And just a reminder to those of you out there who might want to drop one in the next couple minutes, at CU Palestine, hashtag Edward Said. A question maybe to shift into the present, because it's been a remarkable journey and time spent. As you said, we speak of him in the present tense, but it's inevitable that we've been looking backwards too. There's a question that says, can you address how to translate this debate into action? Should we be concerned, or how should we be concerned with activism?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's one point in Edward's writings when he says that he gives lectures sometimes, and then people stand up at the end and they say, what should we do? And he writes, I refuse to answer that question, because he didn't think it was the proper purview of the intellectual. He understood the intellectual to be causing discomfort, trying to point out inconsistencies, trying to produce different frameworks, checking the facts, making the arguments, elucidating it. So I think that what he didn't like was the idea that an intellectual should be in the place of the ruler. And he says this, and he worries about how the discourse of rule has saturated the intellectual, right? So if we sit up here and go, okay, everybody, here are the 5 things we need you to do, right? And then send you on your way. What kind of position are we in at that moment? I mean, I have obviously several, we both have clear political commitments that one could track. But I think one has to sort of, respectfully resist the question. I'm going to get in trouble for that, aren't I?
No,
I can see it now.
Yes, even I'm feeling impatient at that, yeah.
You know what, let me just say this, because there's a very important footnote in Brother Rashid's text where he talks about on page 620 of the 2nd volume of Henry Kissinger's memoir. He says, America has functioned as Israel's lawyer. Israel's lawyer. That means that as American citizens, in our name, the American government has functioned in such a way that it has not just hidden and concealed the suffering, but helped reproduce it in more intense ways. And as American citizens who are concerned about truth, and Adorno used to say what? The condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. Everybody's suffering, anybody's suffering. We have a fundamental role to tell the truth about the role of America as the kind of broker of deceit that it has been. That's contrary to what happened in March 1945 when Franklin Delano Roosevelt told the head of Saudi Arabian Empire, we will not proceed unless we check with you, and we'll do nothing hostile to Arabs. That's March 1945 on the way from Yalta. And every president has violated that statement in a letter to the repressive, autocratic, regimenting Saudi Arabian regime. Everyone. So it's a matter of trying to get that truth out, honestly, in organized ways, supporting the young people. And a lot of this will be, a crucial role will be played by the young Jewish brothers and sisters who are willing to tell the truth vis-a-vis your mamas and your daddies. That you refuse to live in an empire, in a democratic experiment that does not treat other human beings with dignity and decency in our name. That's true for the Philippines, it's true for Guatemala, it's true for the West Bank, it's true for Ethiopia too, it's also true for China. But we're talking about Palestine tonight. So in that sense, Edward was saying, I'm not going to tell you one thing to do, I agree. I'm not going to tell you two things to do, I agree. Understand what is happening and what is being done in your name. And your refusal to allow it to happen to the best of your ability, whatever form it takes. As a filmmaker, as a poet, as an artist, as a professor, as a chauffeur, as a sanitation worker, whatever it is, whatever form.
I guess I would just add one thing here, which is that, I mean, it's interesting that we are two non-Palestinians up here who are addressing the issue of the public intellectual, but we have to make sure that the absence of the Palestinian is not a condition of legitimacy, right? So the real question for me is, what are we hearing from Palestine? What are people in Palestine asking us to do? Is there a call to us? Is there a request? Are there ways of making solidarity with, say, the prisoner solidarity movement? I mean, I noticed that there was a solidarity between prisoners in Palestine and Pelican Bay.
Absolutely.
California. That was a moving, interesting solidarity. It's actually one that was initiated by the Palestinian prisoner organizations. What's the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement asking us to do? What are they telling us about how our institutions are complicit with the reproduction of the occupation or the sanitization of Zionism more generally? How do we respond to that call? Those are two huge, widespread civil movements in Palestine, and they do ask for certain kinds of solidarity, and they do help us orient ourselves, since we don't want to be over here deciding what's the best thing to do for Palestine, right? Then we're technocratic intellectuals who are divorced from a democratic struggle, from a struggle for self-determination. That's right. From the outside, if you're going to decide what Palestine should do, then you're undercutting self-determination, and Palestine hasn't yet had self-determination. You know, that's the least we can do is hear, read what it is that is being asked of us, and make judgments about it, surely. Absolutely. You know, we don't just like, oh, okay, anything. No. We make judgments about what we can do, how we can respond, what's the ethical and political call, and how does it resonate with me, and what can I do from within my position or from within my institution, within my religious institution, within my my family. And although I'm extremely pleased and honored to be with James, part of Jewish Voice for Peace, which I think has effectively made extraordinary solidaristic links with Palestinian grassroots organizations, especially the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement. I think we have to make sure it doesn't just stay Jews and Palestinians. Yes. Because the solidarities that Edward envisioned were solidarities among colonized people and among the forcibly exiled, and so it's a broader kind of coalition, right? We can't just stay in that dyadic frame. Absolutely,
very, very important.
I must say, and that was the most elegant honoring of Edward Said's injunction against talking about activism by breaching it that I could have imagined.
All
so
right.
Thank you. We have two other questions that are somewhat linked, and they refer, I think, at least for me, back to that astonishing quotation from Hannah Mashrawi's dissertation, the last word of which was very surprising to me, when she talks about this collective sociocide and both bio and cultural death of all of these various folks over history, and ends with that this leads her to an unprecedented, and the word she used was knowledge.
Yeah.
Because I was waiting for unprecedented something, and knowledge was a surprise, actually, and a great one. Two questions. One's pretty depressing. Hasn't Palestinian culture already gone into oblivion? The other, connected to it though, how should Palestinians connect their suffering to the suffering of others? What is the role of allies? I think we've already addressed some of that in Mr. most recent remarks. Of allies.
It's funny, I have to overcome my temptation to be slightly rude in relation to the question, and I feel like maybe you could take it.
I think rudeness has a role in a
I know
place.
it does.
No,
Okay,
no.
I'll get there.
No, you actually.
No, I mean, look. I mean, first of all, what we mean by Palestinian culture, I mean, it certainly is, if you go to Palestine, it is not a place of oblivion. It is an active, interesting place where people are arguing with each other a lot and making excellent food and doing many other things in life. So, are we talking about in the mainstream media? Has it perhaps become lost, or has it gone the way of oblivion? Maybe, but then we have to shift the frame, right? I mean, and that's one of the things Edward was asking us to do, shift the frame. Like something is radically absent in the dominant media, but where is it present? And what are the alternate medias that are making it present and which are producing a kind of counter-hegemonic resistance? And he actually had some real interest in the internet as a site that could disrupt, say, the dominant media non-representation or reductive representation, either terrorist or absent. And I think, so I guess that's one thing. The other point is that I think there are different forms of global solidarity. Some of them are focused on international law and its abrogations, and others are about resistance movements or allies among colonized people. I've noted as well that there's some really interesting connections between first world peoples and Palestinians on the question of indigeneity, how to think about self-rule, how to make the claim for self-rule, how not to replicate certain forms of state sovereignty people don't seem to like, but still honor ideas of political self-determination or self-rule. Those are live questions. Those are intense, important questions, and one can't think them alone. One can't think them alone. In this one moment where he's talking about Adorno, he says it's not possible. He's citing Adorno to the effect that no one can have a cogent thought without that thought being thought elsewhere. In other words, it has to be thought somewhere else in order for it to be cogent here. It can't just be my private thought. It has to be something someone else can think or has thought, or something I can think with others, which means not just within this framework, but in a comparative framework. And he was a comparative literature professor, right? And he made the case for comparative diasporas, and I think we could, on the basis of his work, also make a case for comparative genocide, which doesn't mean all genocides are the same, but it does mean that we have to develop those kinds of frameworks that are not just about thinking how these catastrophes happen in different times and spaces, but what kinds of alliances they foster, and even eventually or implicitly what kind of political solidarity that might lead to.
But let me just say a quick word about this question, though, because the question for me is about memory, and it's about visibility. We live in a neoliberal capitalist society that's obsessed with three processes: financializing, privatizing, and militarizing. Highly financialized economy. 42% of the profits go to big banks. 30 years ago, they went to corporations. Privatizing, education, prisons, right across the board. Militarizing, imperial tentacles, drones, U.S. drones dropped on innocent people, AFRICOM, we can go on and on and on, you see. In such a context, there's a relative erasure of memory and a marginalizing of certain kind of visibility. So you take the Palestinian catastrophe and the memory of it within an American regime of financializing, privatizing, and militarizing. You hardly hear any talk about it. The head of the American empire can go to the United Nations and give a whole speech and not say one mumbling word about Palestinian brothers and sisters. And he's got the world looking at him, billions and billions. He goes to the White House, doesn't say a mumbling word about it vis-a-vis the head of the Israeli regime. And that's what you get on Fox News, MSNBC, the right-wing version and the neoliberal wing version, so narrow, so truncated, so often vacuous that memory drops out, visibility drops out. People want to, well, are the Palestinians, are they still there in Gaza? You don't say. What are they doing in Gaza? What, you got a lot of creativity going on, as you rightly say. But how are people getting access to it other than social media, which is also privatized in its own way? But privatization can be used against privatization. We know that. We can be dialectical about it in that way. But the dominant orientation, the dominant gaze, to use that language, is within a neoliberal capitalist regime that makes it difficult for. That's why we don't hear any talk about memory of the 1 million Filipinos who were killed by U.S. imperial forces in the 1890s. Anybody made a film about that? Anybody got discourse about that? Now it's probably half, because I know you and Brother Ang do wonderful stuff. You and Brother Ang do wonderful. But all I'm saying is that it's so selective, given the ideological criteria in light of the larger structure, even though the choices that we make still make a difference. I mean, I'm with Edward on this. Agency still makes a difference.
All right, so I'm just going to add to that one thing, which is that neoliberalism has certainly arrived in Palestine, in the sense that all those neoliberal metrics have entered into the non-governmental organizations who are helping to keep universities alive, who are helping to establish irrigation, who are working throughout the infrastructure, right? So one of the things that happens is that the infrastructure, of course, gets bombed or destroyed, and then the NGOs come in with their neoliberal metrics and rebuild it, and it's a cycle, right? And one of the problems with it is that you don't actually think about, well, what is it that is actually undermining the infrastructural conditions of Palestine systematically? What are those policies, and how has the Israeli state imposed them? And then if we're only trying to ameliorate the effects through a certain and we can measure them according to neoliberal metrics, like people are functioning better, or they're able to get to whatever their work site is if they have a work site, or whatever that is, we're actually producing a kind of rationality that is complicit with the occupation, even though it's trying to ameliorate its effects. So neoliberalism has definitely arrived. And it seems to me also to undercut these basic questions of self-determination, which I keep coming back to. What would it be to build those institutions in ways that the Palestinian people would like, and to have them sustainable on the basis of that population's desires?
So we're wrapping up.
Okay, sorry.
This is your last chance to be embarrassing, contrary, or
I've done
rude.
my bit.
Oh, yeah. But if there's any, just 1 minute, really, it's 8:30, if there's a final thought you'd like to share with us tonight before we leave.
I just want to say I'm really thrilled to be here with Cornel West. He's one of my favorite interlocutors, and when I say one of them, I mean actually that the conversation with him is like no other in the world. And I treasure it every time. I treasure it every time. And I'm just as happy as I could possibly be.
No, right back at my dear sister. One last word, though. One last word. Okay. That when you think of the towering public intellectuals, the term I don't like, I like the term democratic intellectual, but the towering public intellectuals in the American empire, the 20th century, John Dewey, Columbia, W.B. Du Bois, first part of the 20th century, you see, Edward Wilson, and then we can add some others. Then here comes Edward. He is committed to a notion of the public. And there are some contenders, James Baldwin and Susan Sontag and some others. But Edward is committed to the public. But he arrives at a time when the neoliberal regime, which is in the early 70s, is becoming more popular and becomes hegemonic by the late 80s, by the mid-late 80s. Even under conservative auspices of Reagan, it's still neoliberal in terms of it being capitalist tied to those three tendencies. So he has to cut even more radically against the grain. When Du Bois invokes public and Dewey invokes public, people have a memory in the sense of the public. The New Deal was real. That Roosevelt did commit class suicide against his well-to-do Hyde Park friends. But by the time you get to the 80s, the notions of the public become more and more elusive, farther removed from memory. So he has to be even more heroic. And then he's Palestinian. Oh my God. I mean, the notion that the greatest public intellectual in the American empire, the latter part of the 20th century, would be a Palestinian? Just think about that. But it's true.
It is true.
But as a Palestinian, he's just not every Palestinian. He's somebody who is as highbrow, sophisticated, refined, creative, also has his limitations. But he's courageous, open-minded, self-critical, and willing to bear witness in such a way that 10 years later, we could come to the same spot that he lectured and wrestled with for 40 years and still be on fire like he was, because he was always on fire. I love that about Brother Edward. Love that about him. It brings tears to my eyes and just thinking about all this energy that he would dispense. How could he do so much in so little time? He didn't have computers in the same way. You know? And the flights took more hours. Think of the level of sacrifice that took. And when he found out he had leukemia in September 1991, he didn't stop. His brother Messick was telling me that he saw Edward give a lecture in the afternoon after having chemotherapy that morning, and he had more energy he'd ever seen of any intellectual behind the lectern. That's the kind of commitment the brother had, Edward Said. We love you, Brother Edward, and we'll never forget you.
Okay.
Well, I think Edward Said would say amen to that too. Thank you, guys.